This is the DAR Today podcast, and I'm your host, Brooke Bullmaster Stewart. We're taking the DAR Today podcast on the road, as you know, and for those who are listening only on the audio-only version of our podcast, we are standing in front of Mount Rushmore. These founders of our nation had such an incredible vision, of course, for what America could be. And it's like our episode today, we're going to be talking about the founders of our society, the National Society, Daughters of the American Revolution, a society based upon service, the largest women's service organization in the world. And today we're going to be talking about the beginnings of that incredible organization and these women that started this. Now, of course, behind me are depicted only two of our nation's founders, but the other two presidents that are carved into this mountain were also visionaries, continuing to build our nation and its strength. And just like those four founders of our national society, it wasn't just the four founders who are the entirety of the strength of our society. There continue to be women who are building this society, making it even stronger than when it first started. On October 11th, 1890, 18 women and 4 men met in Washington for the purpose of organizing the Daughters of the American Revolution. And if you're a DAR member, you've probably heard the intro. But we thought that as our National Day of Service is coming up this week on October 11th, we'd love to relate maybe a little bit more of the backstory than you've heard tell in the past. These women were smart, passionate, and maybe even considered a little feisty. So why don't you grab yourself a cup or a glass of something yummy? I'll have my coffee, and let's tell the tale of Eugenia Washington, Mary DeShay, Mary Lockwood, and Ellen Hardin Walworth. Our story actually originates with the Sons of the American Revolution, or SAR, an organization that had recently been founded in New York City on April 30th, 1889. You'll be surprised to learn that back during that first year, some SAR societies permitted women to join as members, and others did not. At the next year's general meeting in April of 1890, that situation changed, and the matter of female membership was put to a vote. From that point forward, the SAR decided to officially exclude women from its membership. This event sparked controversy and discussion in the national press and caught the attention of Mary Smith Lockwood. Incensed that the contributions of women to the American Revolution were not being recognized, Mrs. Lockwood wrote a fiery editorial that was published in the Washington Post on July 13, 1890. In it, she demonstrated convincingly that women had contributed much to the revolutionary cause that had previously been overlooked and ignored. Her editorial posited, "Were there no mothers of the Revolution?" William O. McDowell, Vice President General of SAR, disagreed with the SAR's vote, yet believed that women should form their own similar patriotic organization. He wrote his own letter to the Post, dated July 21st, urging women to organize and offering his assistance. 6 women soon replied, including Miss Mary DeShay, who wrote, "I am good for any amount of work." 18 women attended the first official organizing meeting held on October 11, 1890 at the Strathmore Arms boarding house at 810 12th Street, the home of Mrs. Lockwood. This gathering included the 4 women traditionally considered to be the organization's founders. They were joined by 4 men also attending the meeting and formed the first advisory board to the NSDAR, as it was Mary Smith Lockwood's initial 1890 article that's responsible for the groundswell of interest in the new society. Let's begin with her. Mary Smith Lockwood was a woman who accomplished as much as any other in modern history to elevate her sex and to secure to herself an honorable place in the literary world. Born in Chautauqua, New York, Mary lost her mother when just 4 years old, causing her and her older brother to become very close. To him, her last book, The Historic Homes of Washington, is adoringly dedicated. She was physically slight but strong and rather below the medium height. She is described as having firmness, strength, and an executive ability of a high order. She was friendly to all progressive movements, especially those relevant to women. She was the founder of the celebrated Travel Club, which met at her home, the Strathmore Arms, for many long years. Now, should you think that this was a little basic travel club, it was anything but. The speakers and topics discussed at these meetings were unsurpassed. Speakers included past governors, commissioners. It was a very prestigious organization. As a journalist and writer, she was keenly aware of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., a club restricted to men only, where they mostly played poker, drank, and told very colorful stories. But as time went on, the club became much more than a place for male journalists to relax. Within a couple of years of its founding, it had become a regular spot for newsmakers to meet reporters. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson had all dropped by to talk, as well as leading businessmen, explorers, diplomats, congressional leaders, and entertainers. Women reporters couldn't care less about playing poker, but they were irate at being barred from attending these news events. What infuriated them most was the arrival of the Prince of Wales. The National Press Club announced it would host him, but women would not be allowed to come. This was social news, the bread and butter of many female journalists at the time. Well, 28 women ended up creating the Women's National Press Club, and who served as one of its presidents? Why, our own Mary Smith Lockwood, of course, always a proponent of women's rights and equality of opportunity. Amazingly, Mary also held the position of Lady Manager at Large of the Columbia Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, and was among the most efficient managers of the Women's Board, throwing immense labor into the work of classification and exercising serious responsibilities in the Committee on the Press. We look at her with amazement and wonder when we hear of this little woman doing so much and still holding all her faculties with such leisurely poise. She certainly demonstrated the possibility of combining business with literature, both with an active symphony in social reforms and with a womanly grace. Mrs. Lockwood is called the pen founder of DAR. There have been 4 founders' medals created, one for each. But interestingly, Mary Smith Lockwood's pin and medallion says service, and the other 3 say founder. Just 16 days after her 91st birthday, Mary Lockwood passed away. In newspapers and speeches, she was lauded and praised by so many for all that she did for DAR, and of course, all of her other faithful endeavors. DAR founder Eugenia Washington was born in 1840 near Charleston in what is now West Virginia. She was the daughter of William and Margaret Washington. Eugenia's mother was a great-niece of Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and Eugenia's revolutionary ancestor was her great-grandfather, Colonel Samuel Washington, brother of George Washington. She was educated by her father, who was a graduate of William and Mary College. In 1859, when she was 19 years old, her father moved the family to Falmouth, Virginia, just north of Fredericksburg. During the Civil War, her mother had died, their property was destroyed, and the family had little money. Eugenia's father was disabled, paralyzed in fact, and he relied on her to care for him. When the Battle of Fredericksburg was imminent in December 1862, Miss Washington wanted to escape with her father to a place of safety quickly, but was delayed 1 full day because a wounded federal officer was brought to her door and placed in her care while he waited for a surgeon. The battle had begun by that time, and they were ready to flee, and she and her father were caught on the battlefield. Eugenia found shelter for both of them in a small trench left by a cannon. They were forced to remain in that spot for a whole day and witnessed the entire battle from that position. Before we go on from that episode in Eugenia's life, it might be helpful to fully understand what happened with this battle. First, it was the longest in all of the Civil War. The losses in just this one battle were about 18,500 in only 4 days. That's basically 4,625 soldiers each day that were killed. The war itself at that point threatened to spin out of control. Burial truces, along with the sights, sound, and smells of the dead, had all driven home the rising costs of civil war. Visiting his wounded brother George, Walt Whitman, the poet and journalist, noticed, and I quote, "a heap of amputated feet, legs, arms, and hands," end quote, near one hospital tent. Clara Barton vividly described the treatment of the wounded at Chatham Manor, just on the other side of the Rappahannock River. Eventually, those sufferers would be taken to division hospitals or transported to Washington, where people like Louisa May Alcott and others worked. It is said that Eugenia Washington's experiences, the passion she brought to her work with DAR, was forever forged in that cannon trench that day. That this inspired in her a will to assist women from both the North and the South in the worthy cause of preserving their shared heritage and to honor these brave patriots who fought for the birth of our nation. At the close of the war, Miss Eugie, as she was fondly referred, was offered a government position with the U.S. Post Office Department, so she and her father moved to Washington, D.C. While visiting a relative in Louisiana, Miss Washington attended a Roman Catholic mission, converting to Roman Catholicism from her Episcopal faith, after which she became a prominent lecturer of the Catholic faith. Miss Washington died at her home in 1900. She was 60 years old. According to one of the obituaries we found when researching this story, I quote, "The imminent cause of Miss Washington's death was hemorrhage of the heart. She had, however, been in ill health for some time previous to her demise, but had refused to absent herself from her duties in the Post Office Department, even upon the advice of her physicians." End quote. Washington was interred at the Moncure family burial ground of her sister's estate, Glencairn, in Falmouth, Virginia. Now, Mary DeShae's story was also born upon a passion from something she witnessed in her life and career. Mary was born in 1850 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was well educated and for a short time studied at what is now the University of Kentucky. When her family was impoverished by the Civil War, the women in her family needed to work, so Miss DeShae and her mother opened a private school. Later, Mary accepted a position with the Lexington Public School System and then took a job as a clerk in Washington, D.C. in December 1885. After spending a few years in Washington, Miss DeShae accepted a teaching position in Sitka, Alaska in 1888, 4,062 miles away from D.C. We know travel today. What was that like for Mary at that time? One can only imagine what she faced in the bush territories of Alaska in 1888. One thing Mary discovered was the living conditions endured by the Alaskan natives were unacceptable, and her written protest to the government in Washington resulted in a federal investigation. She returned to Lexington in 1889, but shortly thereafter accepted a post in Washington as a clerk in the pension office. She later worked as a copyist in the Office of Indian Affairs. Do you recall our interview with the American Indians Committee National Chair Beth Garner? You might remember that this committee has been around since the early days of DAR. One could imagine that Mary and her experiences led to that being an early focus of our DAR work. The last of the four founders was Ellen Hardin Walworth. Born in 1832, Ellen Walworth may well be described as a brilliant woman deeply rooted in history and well ahead of her time. Her intellect was a reflection of her upbringing. She was the eldest of four children of Jacksonville attorney John Hardin, a Kentucky native. The son of a United States senator, Hardin was elected to Congress as a Whig in 1843 and was a political rival of Abraham Lincoln, despite the fact that he was a cousin to Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd. Her father was eventually killed at the Battle of Buena Vista. One of Ellen's younger brothers, Martin, was an 1859 West Point grad who rose to brigadier general in Civil War service. Her great-grandfather, Lieutenant John Hardin, served under Colonel Daniel Morgan at the battles of Saratoga. Her family was certainly involved in service. Honoring veterans was a theme throughout her entire life. In 1851, 4 years after her father passed, her mother Sarah married Reuben Hyde Walworth, a Revolutionary War descendant and the last Chancellor of New York. The Chancellor of New York during the existence of the post was the highest judicial officer in the state. The family moved to Walworth's home called Pine Grove in Saratoga Springs, New York. There, her stepfather brought Ellen to the still uninterpreted Saratoga battlefield. It was her first opportunity to walk where her great-grandfather had fought, and she called it a marked event in her young life. In 1852, Ellen married her stepfather's youngest son, Mansfield Tracy Walworth. A complex journey of self began for her. They had 6 children together, but unfortunately, as the years passed, Ellen became trapped in a very volatile marriage, as her husband's mental health steadily deteriorated and he became physically and mentally abusive. She left him in 1861 and moved her children to a farm near Louisville, Kentucky. Several attempts at reconciliation followed before Ellen finally settled in 1868 in Washington, D.C., where she worked as a government clerk. However, her husband continued the abuse even during and into her 8th pregnancy. In January 1871, she went back to Saratoga to seek what was called then a limited divorce. There, she supported herself by converting the family home, Pine Grove, into a girls' boarding school, which she managed for 15 years. Still, Mansfield continued to threaten Ellen and even their eldest son, Frank. Finally, Frank could take it no more and shot and killed his father in a New York City hotel room on June 3, 1873. A very public trial followed, and Ellen testified in her son's favor, but Frank received a life sentence. Well, Ellen devoted herself to securing his release. She studied and earned a law degree from New York University to help overturn his conviction. In 1877, the year after getting this degree, a judge pardoned Frank, declaring he was not responsible for the murder by reason of insanity. I know these things aren't often talked about with regard to domestic abuse, but this is 2024, and October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and what an inspiration Ellen was with the way she handled this hardship. But even during all of this, there were so many things she was doing. Ellen was an avid scientist and joined the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1876, the first active female member of the organization. In August 1880, she was one of only a handful of women to present a paper. Hers was entitled Field Work by Amateurs to the association and vocally called for more scientific work by amateurs, particularly women. Along with science, history's call still beckoned to her, and Ellen connected with a like-minded group, the Saratoga Monument Association, or SMA. By 1880, the SMA became the only group of its kind with a woman trustee, as SMA President Horatio Seymour petitioned the group to admit Ellen to the role. She then oversaw the first work to mark formally and interpret the Saratoga battlefield. Ellen was already a prolific historical writer, publishing accounts of the Burgoyne campaign in upstate New York while becoming an expert on the battlefields at Saratoga. It was during these years that she and our other 3 founders began our national society, Daughters of the American Revolution, in 1890, so, naturally, she then became a co-founder of the Saratoga Springs chapter of the DAR, and both national and local organizations soon contemplated further helping Saratoga battlefield. Walworth also assisted in fundraising to restore George Washington's Mount Vernon estate and was one of the earliest voices to call for a national archives. Can we even imagine our country without its extensive national archives? It was in 1893, during a speech at the Chicago World Fair, where Mrs. Walworth talked about this. She was one of the first women in New York State to hold a position on a local board of education. She continued her dedication to patriotic values in 1898 by helping found the Women's National War Relief Association to aid American troops from the Spanish-American War, serving as Director General, meeting the first transports bringing home wounded soldiers from Santiago. She spent the summer in the fever hospitals at Fortress Monroe and Wyckoff, being joined in these hospitals by her daughter, Rubina Walworth. Her daughter lost her life due to this work by contracting the fever herself. Mary Smith Lockwood was 68. Eugenia Washington was 50. Mary DeShay, 40. Ellen Hardin Walworth, 58. At the time these women founded the DAR, these were their ages. A diverse group of women from very different backgrounds. What did they have in common? Their service, their dedication to the cause of historic preservation, education, and patriotism. They collaborated, they worked together, just like we strive to do in our DAR service. What examples they all were, and honestly, what heroes they were, although I would imagine they would not have liked to hear themselves called such. Knowing this much more about these women, perhaps you're hearing some of this information for the first time. Do they inspire you as much as they do me? I'll tell you this much. I'm standing a little bit taller today and working a lot harder on this October 11th, our DAR Day of Service, the day that commemorates the founding of our grand society. Well, we leave you today with this quote by Abraham Lincoln. "I like to see a man proud of the country in which he lives. I like to see a man live so that his country will be proud of him. Well, thanks for listening and be well, dear friends. Let's celebrate the stars and stripes forever and remember, with all of your ancestors behind you, you are the result of the love of thousands. Well, this podcast was written and produced by our incredible team of writers and editors, and we are, as always, so grateful for President General Pamela Rouse Wright and Historian General Suzanne Heskey for their constant guidance. The National Society Daughters of the American Revolution is a nonprofit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization dedicated to preserving our American history, securing the nation's future through better education, and promoting American patriotism. Members are all lineal descendants of those who supported the cause of independence in the Revolutionary War. For more information, please visit dar.org. This is the DAR Today podcast.